Despite being clothed with the Spirit of the Lord and seeing the tribes respond to his call, Gideon still struggled with deep insecurity. The magnitude of the mission continued to weigh heavily on him. Leading an army against such an overwhelming oppressor was no small task, and although God had spoken, Gideon's heart still longed for a more personal and intimate certainty. So he asked for a sign. He did not do so in rebellion or disobedience, but from a faith that was still learning how to stand. Gideon presented his request carefully, acknowledging God's sovereignty and asking that his patience would not turn away from him. He understood that he was standing on holy ground and did not want to act recklessly. The sign he proposed was specific. He placed a fleece of wool on the threshing floor and asked that during the night the dew would fall only on the fleece, while the ground remained dry. If that happened, he would know that God truly intended to deliver Israel through his hand. This was not an attempt to manipulate God, but a human way of seeking reassurance in the midst of fear. God responded without reproach. When morning came, Gideon found the fleece soaked with dew, while the ground around it was dry. The sign unfolded exactly as requested. The divine response was clear, direct, and merciful. God showed no impatience with the fragility of his servant. Yet Gideon's unrest did not completely disappear. Rather than feeling fully secure, he dared to ask for a second sign. This time he reversed the request, that the fleece would remain dry while the ground was covered with dew. He knew he was pressing further, and so he spoke humbly, asking that the Lord's anger would not be kindled against him. Once again, God agreed. The sign occurred exactly as Gideon had asked. The fleece was dry, and the ground was wet with dew. This repetition was not a sign of divine weakness, but of divine patience. God was shaping a leader who needed to walk closely, step by step, learning to trust. This episode reveals a deep truth. Gideon's faith was not instant or unshakable. It was a faith in process, filled with questions, requests, and confirmations. And God did not reject that process. He did not demand perfect confidence from the beginning, but an honest willingness to move forward. The fleece was not the center of the story. The true lesson lies in the relationship between God and Gideon, a God who meets human fear with patience, and a man who, despite his doubts, refuses to retreat. Each sign strengthened his trust, preparing his heart for an even greater test. With the confirmations received, Gideon was ready to advance, not because fear had vanished, but because he had learned that his security did not depend on his own strength, but on God's faithfulness. The season of signs had fulfilled its purpose. Now the stage was set for the next act. The army was assembled. Direction was clear, but God still had something crucial to teach. Before granting victory, he would completely redefine how that victory would be achieved. With the army assembled and direction seemingly clear, Gideon could have assumed that the time to advance had finally arrived. Thousands of men were prepared to face the Midianites. From a human standpoint, the logical strategy would have been to strengthen the ranks even further, secure alliances, and maximize available force. But God had an entirely different plan. The first divine word was unsettling. God declared that the number of men with Gideon was too great, not because they were sufficient to defeat the enemy, but because they were too many to allow the victory to clearly reflect who was truly acting. If Israel prevailed with a large army, the people might claim the credit and once again forget that deliverance came from the Lord. God's intention was unmistakable. The battle ahead was not to become a celebration of human power. Victory had to be an unmistakable display of divine intervention. For that reason, before facing the enemy, God chose to confront Israel's reliance on numbers and strength. The first reduction was direct. Gideon was instructed to announce that anyone who was afraid could return home. This was not a motivational tactic or an attempt to shame anyone. It was an honest invitation. The result was shocking. Thousands of men left the camp. What looked like mass desertion was, in reality, a purification of the army. Gideon watched as the group shrank dramatically. What once seemed like a multitude now appeared insufficient. Yet God was not finished. Despite the significant reduction, the Lord stated that the army was still too large. The lesson was not yet complete. Then came the second test. God led Gideon and the remaining men down to the water. There, he observed the way they drank. Some knelt and drank directly from the water. Others brought the water to their mouths with their hands, remaining alert. God instructed that only these men were to remain. The selection was not based on physical strength, but on obedience to a seemingly simple instruction. The final number was startling. From thousands, only 300 men remained with Gideon. From any military analysis, the situation appeared absurd. Facing a massive enemy force with such a small number defied all logic, but that was precisely the point. God was redefining the battle. Victory would not be the result of strategic planning or numerical superiority. It would be an expression of absolute trust. Every man who remained had to understand that his presence did not guarantee success. Only obedience and faith would. This moment was critical in Gideon's formation. God was not merely reducing the army. He was reducing human dependence. He was teaching his servant that leadership does not always mean gathering resources, but learning to move forward when everything appears insufficient. The reduction was not punishment. It was preparation. God was clearing the stage so that when victory came, there would be no doubt about its source. Israel's strength would not be in its numbers, but in the faithfulness of the God who fought for them. With only 300 men, the story entered its most improbable phase. And just when human logic had no arguments left, God was about to offer one final confirmation that would strengthen Gideon's heart before the decisive confrontation. With only 300 men at his side, Gideon stood at the most vulnerable point of the entire process. From a human perspective, there was no margin for error. The reduction of the army had pushed the situation to its limit, and although obedience had been clear, the emotional weight of what lay ahead was immense. God knew Gideon's inner state, and once again chose to strengthen his servant before the decisive moment. During the night, the Lord spoke to Gideon. He instructed him to go down to the enemy camp, not to attack yet, but to listen. God understood that Gideon needed more than instructions. He needed courage. And that confirmation would come, surprisingly, not from his own people, but from the enemy itself. Gideon descended with his servant. The silence of the night surrounded the Midianite camp. In the distance, the countless tents could be seen, visible evidence of a force that vastly outnumbered the 300 men with Gideon. Every step required courage, but also obedience. Gideon moved forward not because he felt secure, but because he trusted the word he had received. It was then that he overheard a conversation. A Midianite soldier was recounting a dream he had had. In the dream, a loaf of barley bread rolled down from above and struck a tent, collapsing it completely. The image was simple, almost insignificant. Barley bread was the food of the poor, common, unimpressive, and without military value. The interpretation came immediately. The soldier's companion explained the dream without hesitation. The loaf represented the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, and it meant that God had given Midian and the entire army into his hands. This confession did not come from a prophet or an ally, but from the lips of the enemy. That moment changed everything. People. Moreover, the altar was tied to Gideon's own family. Obedience meant confronting his father, his neighbors, and a deeply rooted tradition. Gideon obeyed, but he did so at night. Fear was still present. He did not yet feel secure enough to act in broad daylight. Yet fear did not paralyze him. Though afraid, he chose obedience. He took 10 men, and under the cover of darkness, tore down the altar of Baal, cut down the Asherah pole, and built an altar to the Lord. This obedience was not perfect, but it was real. God did not despise the fact that Gideon acted with fear. What mattered was that he acted. Faith does not always appear as absolute boldness. Sometimes it shows up as trembling obedience. Gideon did not wait until he felt completely ready. He stepped forward despite fear. At dawn, the reaction was immediate. The people discovered what had been done, and outrage spread quickly. They demanded that Gideon be handed over to die. For them, this was not merely the destruction of an altar, but a direct challenge to the spiritual order they had normalized. Then something unexpected happened. Joash, Gideon's father, stepped forward in his defense. Instead of handing his son over, he confronted the people with a piercing question. If Baal truly was a god, why didn't he defend himself? His argument exposed the fragility of idolatry. A god who needs humans to defend him is not worthy of worship. From that day on, Gideon received a new name. He was called Jerubbaal, meaning let Baal contend against him. This name was not a light mockery, but a public spiritual declaration. Every time it was spoken, it reminded the people that Baal had done nothing to defend himself. Gideon's obedience had altered the atmosphere. This first battle was decisive. Before wielding a sword, Gideon learned to obey. Before leading a nation, he confronted idolatry in his own environment. God was forming a leader from the inside out, beginning with what no one else saw, but what sustained the oppression. Obedience in the private realm opened the door to the public one. Gideon's transformation was not built on spectacular acts, but on difficult decisions made in secrecy. And that initial obedience prepared the ground for what would come next. For now, with idolatry confronted and a new identity declared, God was about to move the entire people. The morning after the altar was destroyed revealed how deeply idolatry had taken root in the life of the people. What had happened during the night did not go unnoticed. On the contrary, it sparked immediate outrage. The inhabitants of the area gathered quickly, seeking the one responsible for the act that had disrupted the spiritual order they had come to accept as normal. The accusation was direct. When it was discovered that Gideon was the one who had torn down the altar of Baal, the people demanded his death. To them, this was not merely an act of religious disobedience, but a threat to social stability. Baal had been integrated as a source of security and fertility, and challenging him was seen as a risk that could bring disaster upon everyone. In that critical moment, Joash's reaction was decisive. Gideon's father, instead of yielding to collective pressure, stepped forward and spoke. His intervention was neither emotional nor defensive, but logical and provocative. He asked the people why they were so eager to defend Baal. If Baal truly was a powerful god, he should be able to avenge himself. If he could not, then his supposed divinity was exposed. That reasoning dismantled the crowd's fury. No one could answer the logic presented. The argument exposed the fragility of a faith built on habit and fear rather than truth. What had begun as an attempt at execution turned into an uncomfortable moment of reflection. It was then that Gideon received a new name. From that day on, he was called Jerubbaal, meaning, let Baal contend against him. This name was not imposed as punishment, but as a declaration. Every time it was spoken, it reminded the people that Baal had done nothing to defend himself. Gideon's name became a living testimony to the powerlessness of idols. This shift in identity was more than symbolic. Gideon was no longer just the man who threshed wheat in hiding. He was now publicly associated with an act of spiritual confrontation. The fear that once dominated him began to lose its grip. Obedience had produced a reversal. It was no longer Gideon who stood exposed, but the credibility of the false god. The spiritual atmosphere began to change. Although the people did not immediately return to faithfulness toward the Lord, they were confronted. Idolatry had been openly challenged, and Baal's silence spoke louder than any argument. Something had been broken. Not only an altar, but a collective perception. God was preparing the ground. Before assembling armies, he was reshaping identities, Gideon would not be remembered merely for his lineage or humble origin, but for an obedience that exposed the falsehood of what had spiritually oppressed Israel. The story was moving forward. What began as a private confrontation had become public. The new name marked a transition, and with that identity established, God was ready to take the next step, to clothe Gideon with his spirit, and begin gathering the people for something far greater. After the public confrontation and the shift in identity, the story takes a decisive turn. Up to this point, Gideon had obeyed while afraid, acting privately and facing local consequences. Now God's call began to manifest on a broader and more visible scale. Israel's deliverance would no longer be an isolated act, but a movement involving the entire nation. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Scripture describes this moment as a clothing or enveloping. It was not merely a surge of emotion or a burst of human courage. It was a divine intervention that transformed the man who once hid into someone capable of calling others to action. Fear did not vanish completely, but it no longer governed his decisions. Gideon sounded the trumpet. This act carried both symbolic and practical weight. It was a call to war, but also a public declaration of leadership. By blowing the trumpet, Gideon exposed himself. He could no longer remain anonymous. His calling moved from the private realm into the open. The response began to form. Men from his own clan, Abiezer, gathered first. Soon after, warriors from Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali joined them. The call crossed regions and tribes, uniting a people who had lived fragmented by fear and oppression. The obedience of one man began to generate collective movement. This moment reveals a foundational truth. When God empowers, He also connects. Leadership that flows from the Spirit does not impose itself through force. It draws people in. Gideon did not need persuasive speeches. Authority did not come from personality, but from God's presence resting upon him. Yet the gathering of the army did not erase inner doubts. Even as the people responded, Gideon continued wrestling with insecurity. The contrast between the magnitude of the task and his own self-perception was still present. God was shaping a leader who would learn to walk between growing faith and lingering fear. The call marked a clear shift. Israel was no longer merely reacting to oppression. It was beginning to organize against it. The trumpet did not only summon men to battle, it awakened hope that oppression was not the final chapter. God was aligning the people. Tribes responded, hearts stirred, and the stage was being set for something that would defy all human logic. Because although the army was assembling, God still had a crucial lesson to teach. Victory would not come by numbers or strength. Before advancing into battle, Gideon would still need one more confirmation. Not because God doubted, but because he was shaping a leader who would learn to trust step by step. And that need would open the door to one of the most well-known tests of faith in all of Scripture. Drew near to the one who was hiding, the one working quietly, the one with no expectations of greatness. This encounter marks a crucial turning point, not only because it introduces the protagonist, but because it reveals how God operates. He does not wait for people to be ready before calling them. He calls them in order to transform them. He does not demand pre-existing courage. He declares it. He does not look for formed heroes. He forms those he calls. Gideon did not yet realize it, but in that moment, while trying to protect a small amount of wheat, he was being watched by the God who intended to use him to deliver an entire nation. The calling had begun, not with a command, but with a new identity spoken over someone still living under the weight of fear. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The angel's greeting did not produce immediate enthusiasm in Gideon. It did not awaken a heroic response or confident acceptance of the call. Instead, it provoked an honest reaction, loaded with questions that had been accumulating in the heart of the people for years. Gideon did not respond like a soldier ready for battle, but like someone weary of hearing promises that seemed disconnected from the reality he was living. His first response was a direct objection. Gideon questioned the claim that the Lord was with them. If God truly walked alongside Israel, how could their constant oppression be explained? Where were the miracles they had heard about from generation to generation? Why was the people who had been delivered from Egypt now living hidden and humiliated? These questions were not born from arrogance. They were the reflection of a wounded faith. Gideon voiced out loud what many thought in silence. The distance between the stories of the past and the experience of the present had created a deep internal tension. The powerful God spoken of by their elders seemed absent from the daily suffering of those crushed by Midianite oppression. The angel did not rebuke Gideon for asking. He did not accuse him of unbelief or silence him. Instead, he listened. God was not threatened by doubts. He allowed Gideon to expose his confusion, because those questions were part of the transformation process. Faith that is never expressed eventually suffocates. Faith that is dialogued can grow. Gideon continued by exposing his limitations. He did not only doubt God's presence, he doubted himself. He reminded the angel that his clan was the weakest in Manasseh and that he was the youngest in his father's household. He did not see himself as a deliverer or a leader. From his perspective, the call felt disproportionate, almost unreal. God's response was brief, but decisive. He did not argue statistics or deny Gideon's social reality. He did not try to convince him that he was strong by nature. Instead, he offered a promise: "I will be with you." That statement completely redefined the equation. Victory would not depend on human capacity, but on divine presence. God did not answer every question, but he answered the most important one. He did not explain every reason for past suffering or outline every future step. He affirmed his companionship. For God, that truth was sufficient. Where he is present, human weakness ceases to be an insurmountable barrier. This dialogue marked a turning point. Gideon was not fully convinced, but neither was he dismissed. God did not demand blind and immediate faith. He accepted a faith that moved slowly, filled with doubts and questions, yet willing to keep engaging. The story of Gideon reveals something essential. God does not reject those who question sincerely. He does not discard those who expose their fears. Divine calling does not always come to confident people, but to hearts willing to bring their reality before God. The dialogue had begun, and although Gideon did not yet fully understand it, that honest exchange was preparing the ground for the signs that would follow. God did not withdraw in the face of doubt. He remained, guiding step by step a man who was learning to believe in a new way. Despite the dialogue with the angel, Gideon was not ready to move forward without a deeper confirmation. This was not stubborn unbelief, but a genuine need for certainty. The weight of the calling was too great to accept on words alone. Gideon needed to know, beyond any doubt, that he was not facing an illusion or a product of his own imagination. So he asked for a sign. He did not do so with arrogance or demands, but with respect. He asked for time to prepare an offering, an action that revealed his desire to honor God before taking any step forward. The angel accepted the request and waited, reflecting God's patience toward human fragility. Gideon returned with what he had. He prepared a young goat and unleavened bread, using simple resources, fitting for someone living in a time of scarcity. He did not offer abundance, but obedience. He placed the meat and the bread on a rock and poured out the broth as instructed. Every gesture carried a mixture of fear, expectation, and reverence. Then the unexpected happened. The angel touched the offering with the tip of his staff, and immediately fire sprang from the rock, consuming both the meat and the bread completely. This was not a slow or controlled flame, but a sudden manifestation, unmistakable and impossible to attribute to natural causes. In that same moment, the angel disappeared from Gideon's sight. Gideon's reaction was immediate. Fear overwhelmed him, as he realized that he had been in the presence of the angel of the Lord. The experience did not fill him with excitement, but with deep reverence. He understood the holiness of the moment and his own smallness before the divine presence. His first response was the belief that he would die for having seen the messenger of God face to face. But God spoke again, not through the angel, but directly, reassuring Gideon. He told him not to be afraid, that he would not die. Those words sealed the experience. Gideon had not only received a supernatural sign, but also a word of peace. Gideon responded by building an altar. He named it, "The Lord is Peace." This was not an impulsive gesture, but a profound declaration. In the midst of oppression, doubt, and fear, Gideon had discovered that God's presence did not bring destruction, but safety. Peace did not come from the absence of enemies, but from the certainty that God was with him. This sign marked a clear turning point. It did not eliminate all of Gideon's doubts, but it established a firm foundation. No longer was this simply a calling heard. It was an experience lived. The fire had consumed the offering, but it had also ignited a growing faith in the heart of a man who had once hidden in fear. God did not rush the process. He allowed Gideon to move step by step, confirming his presence with patience and power. The sign was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a deeper transformation. Because before facing armies, Gideon would have to face something closer and more dangerous: the idolatry within his own household. Before allowing Gideon to confront the Midianites, God led him into a much closer, more personal, and far riskier confrontation. This was not a public battle or a visible victory, but a silent test that would reveal the depth of his obedience. Israel's deliverance would not begin on the battlefield, but within Gideon's own heart and inside the boundaries of his household. The divine instruction was clear and direct. God commanded Gideon to tear down the altar of Baal that belonged to his father and to cut down the Asherah pole beside it. In its place, he was to build an altar to the Lord and offer a sacrifice according to what had been prescribed. This command confronted not only national idolatry, but family idolatry as well. Gideon was not merely being called to lead Israel. He was being called to break the spiritual structures that sustained oppression. The risk was real. Destroying a pagan altar was not a symbolic gesture. Baal was a god worshipped by the community, and challenging his cult meant exposing oneself to the anger of the story of Gideon begins in one of the darkest and most exhausting periods in Israel's history. This was not a brief crisis or an isolated defeat, but a prolonged state of oppression that had shaped the daily life of an entire generation. For years, Israel lived under the domination of the Midianites, a people who did not merely conquer with weapons, but slowly dismantled stability, economy, and dignity wherever they ruled. The origin of this oppression was not external. Once again, Israel had turned away from the Lord. The people allowed idolatry to seep into their spiritual life, repeating a painful cycle that had become all too familiar. Disobedience, abandonment of God, foreign oppression, and desperate cries for deliverance. Spiritual unfaithfulness always produced visible and devastating consequences. The Midianites did not rule from palaces or impose formal laws. Their strategy was far more cruel. Year after year, precisely when the crops were ready for harvest, they invaded the land like a swarm. They came in great numbers, accompanied by Amalekites and other eastern peoples, consuming everything in their path. They left no food behind, spared neither livestock nor fields, and showed no mercy. Their goal was not merely control, but total impoverishment. The land was left devastated. Fields that should have been symbols of provision and blessing became scenes of constant loss. The people's labor felt pointless. They planted in fear and harvested in desperation, knowing everything could be stolen at any moment. Oppression did not only strip away resources, it drained hope. Fear began to define everyday life. The Israelites abandoned their towns and hid in caves, strongholds, and improvised shelters in the mountains. They lived concealed, alert, and anxious. The nation called to live in courage and confidence now survived in the shadows, adapting to fear as if it were a natural condition of existence. Poverty spread throughout the land. This was not occasional hardship, but extreme deprivation. Israel was reduced to complete misery. Each year of oppression weakened the people further, not only physically, but spiritually. Their identity as a chosen nation slowly eroded under the weight of constant humiliation. It was then that Israel cried out to the Lord. This cry was neither immediate nor automatic. It rose from a people exhausted and broken by years of abuse and loss. When strength and human solutions were gone, Israel finally lifted its voice toward God, acknowledging, if only through desperation, that only He could bring deliverance. This cry did not come from strength, but from ruin. And it is precisely at this point, when the people are hiding, impoverished and spiritually broken, that God chooses to begin a new chapter. Not yet by raising a deliverer, but by exposing the root of the problem, a heart that had turned away from Him. This is how the story of Gideon begins, not with heroism or triumph, but with an oppressed people, weakened faith, and a nation that had learned to survive instead of live. From this landscape of ruin, God would begin forming one of the most unexpected and strategic judges in all of Scripture. Israel's cry was not a ritual act or a carefully crafted prayer. It was a shout born from exhaustion. Years of oppression had eroded every illusion of self-sufficiency. The people were no longer crying out from confidence in their own strength, but from the awareness of their failure. When Israel finally lifted its voice, it did so recognizing, at least implicitly, that it had reached its limit. God responded to the cry, but not in the way many would have expected. Before raising a deliverer, the Lord sent a prophet. He did not bring an army or an escape strategy. He brought a word, and that word did not begin with promises of victory, but with truth. God chose to confront the people before rescuing them, because the root of the problem was not only the Midianites, but Israel's own heart. The message was clear and direct. The prophet reminded the people who God was and what He had done for them. He spoke of the Lord who brought them out of Egypt, who delivered them from slavery, who protected them from powerful enemies, and who gave them the land they now inhabited. This was not an empty history lesson, but a call to spiritual memory. God had not failed. He had been faithful at every stage. He had kept His promises, displayed His power, and shown care and mercy. The present oppression was not evidence of divine absence, but the result of a rupture caused by persistent disobedience. Israel had forgotten its deliverer while chasing other gods. The message confronted them without compromise. The prophet declared that Israel had disobeyed the voice of the Lord. They had feared the gods of the surrounding nations more than they feared God Himself. They had allowed idolatry to infiltrate daily life, justifying it, normalizing it, and eventually embracing it as part of their culture. This moment was uncomfortable, but necessary. God was not humiliating the people out of cruelty, but preparing the ground for real deliverance. Without repentance, any rescue would be temporary. Without confrontation, the cycle would simply repeat itself. The Lord did not only want to free them from external oppression, but to break the internal pattern that kept leading them back into bondage. The silence that followed the message was revealing. There is no record of argument or defense from the people. The word had touched a truth that could not be denied. Israel understood that its situation was not merely an injustice suffered, but a consequence accumulated through wrong choices. Only after this confrontation does the story move forward. God does not ignore the cry, but neither does He separate it from truth. The deliverance that was coming would not simply be a change of circumstances, but a restoration of relationship. The Lord was preparing not only a deliverer, but a people capable of listening to His voice again. And it is within this context, after confrontation, after acknowledgement of failure, that God begins to move the pieces to raise up a man who would never have considered himself a leader. The stage was set. The people had been confronted. The heart had been exposed. And now God would draw near to someone unexpected, in an unlikely place to begin the next phase of his plan. God's intervention did not begin on a battlefield or in a public assembly. It began quietly, in a discreet place, far from power and recognition. While Israel lived under the weight of oppression, one man was carrying out a simple, almost insignificant task, trying to survive without being seen. That man was Gideon. Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress. It was not the proper place for that work. A winepress was meant for crushing grapes, not processing grain. But fear had altered even the most basic practices of daily life. Threshing wheat in an enclosed space was a way to remain hidden, to prevent the Midianites from discovering the harvest and stealing it. Every movement Gideon made was shaped by caution. That detail reveals far more than an agricultural scene. It exposes the emotional and spiritual state of Israel. The people who had been called to live in freedom were now acting in secrecy. Fear had molded behavior. Gideon was not preparing a rebellion. He was trying to preserve what little he had. He was not dreaming of leadership, but of surviving one more day. It was there that the angel of the Lord appeared to him. He did not arrive with noise or spectacle. He sat beneath an oak tree, watching Gideon in his silent labor. The contrast is striking. A divine messenger facing a man in hiding. An eternal calling confronting a life shaped by fear. The first words were disorienting. The angel addressed Gideon as a mighty warrior. This was not a description of what Gideon was doing, but of what God saw in him. At that moment, Gideon did not see himself as brave or powerful. His internal reality clashed sharply with the identity God was declaring over him. This greeting was not empty flattery. It was a prophetic affirmation. God was not speaking from outward appearance, but from purpose. While Gideon defined himself by fear and insignificance, God defined him by what he was destined to become. The call was not rooted in his present condition, but in the future God was ready to shape through him. The contrast was intentional. God chose to approach Gideon at his most vulnerable point, when his life most clearly reflected Israel's oppression. He did not seek the strongest or the most visible. Gideon did not respond with words. He did not shout or celebrate. He bowed and worshipped. The confirmation had arrived in the most unexpected way. God had used the fear of the enemy to strengthen the faith of his servant. What appeared weak and insignificant would be the instrument of victory. Gideon's courage was restored. He returned to the camp no longer filled with doubt, but with conviction. God's word had been confirmed beyond question. Fear no longer ruled his heart. There was now a firm certainty. The battle was not his, but the Lord's. This episode reveals a profound truth. God does not only speak to his servants, he can also use circumstances, even the enemy, to confirm his purpose. When faith falters, he knows exactly how to strengthen it. With his heart established, Gideon was ready. The confirmation had been given. The time for listening was over. Now obedience had to turn into action. The night was moving toward one of the most improbable victories in all of biblical history. With his courage restored and his conviction firm, Gideon returned to the camp. He was no longer the man paralyzed by doubt, but a leader who had received direct confirmation from God. The battle was about to begin, yet not in the way any military strategist would have imagined. There would be no raised swords or traditional frontal assault. God had designed a plan that defied every human expectation. Gideon organized the 300 men. He divided them into 3 companies and gave them precise instructions. Each man was to carry a trumpet, a clay jar, and a torch burning inside the jar. No conventional weapons were distributed. The strategy did not depend on physical strength, but on exact obedience to what God had commanded. The plan appeared absurd. An army facing thousands with tools that seemed completely unfit for warfare. Yet the instruction left no room for interpretation. Every detail had a purpose. God was preparing a scene in which his intervention would be unmistakable. In the middle of the night, they surrounded the enemy camp. They waited for the precise moment when the watch was changing and attention was scattered. Then, at Gideon's signal, the men blew their trumpets, smashed the jars, raised the torches, and shouted with a cry that would seal the victory. The effect was immediate and devastating. The noise, the sudden light, and the sound of the trumpets created total confusion in the Midianite camp. In the darkness, believing they were under attack by a massive army, the enemies turned their swords against one another. Panic swept through their ranks. God had intervened directly. It was not the skill of the men, nor a brilliant maneuver that produced the victory. It was the Lord who unleashed chaos among the enemy. Midian's sword turned against itself. What appeared impossible was accomplished without Israel having to fight hand to hand. The enemy fled. The Midianites began to escape in disorder, abandoning their camp behind them. The oppression that had lasted for years began to collapse in a single night. The victory was complete, unexpected, and entirely attributable to God's action. This moment sealed an eternal lesson. When God fights the battle, human means cease to be the decisive factor. Obedience, even when it seems illogical, opens the door to an intervention that surpasses every human strategy. Gideon and his men witnessed a victory that could only be explained by the presence of God. The night ended with freedom. The people who had lived in hiding now watched as the enemy fled. Humiliation was replaced with hope. Victory had not been born from strength, but from total trust in the God who transforms weakness into triumph. But the story was not yet finished. The enemy's flight would lead to new decisions, new tensions, and new tests for Gideon's leadership. The initial victory would open the door to challenges that would further reveal the character of the judge God had raised up. The initial victory did not mark the end of the conflict, but the beginning of a new phase. Although the Midianite camp had been thrown into chaos, and the enemy was fleeing in disorder, Israel's liberation was not yet fully secured. Oppression would only truly end when the threat was eliminated completely. Gideon understood that stopping halfway would allow fear to return over time. The pursuit began immediately. Gideon sent messengers to the surrounding tribes, calling them to cut off the escape routes of the fleeing Midianites. The response was swift. Men from the tribe of Ephraim mobilized and captured and killed 2 of the Midianite princes. This action was decisive in further weakening the enemy and confirming that the victory was not an accident but a real shift in power. However, cooperation was not without tension. The men of Ephraim confronted Gideon for not calling them earlier to the battle. Their complaint did not arise from a desire for justice, but from wounded pride. They wanted recognition, participation, and honor. Victory had awakened rivalries that had remained dormant during years of oppression. Gideon's response was strategic and humble. He did not reply with confrontation or imposed authority. Instead, he spoke wisely, acknowledging the value of what Ephraim had accomplished. He compared his own role with theirs, emphasizing that their contribution had been greater. With carefully chosen words, he calmed the conflict and prevented division from weakening what God was restoring. The tension dissolved. Gideon's humility protected the unity of the people. This episode demonstrated that leadership is not only about courage on the battlefield, but about discernment during internal conflict. An external victory can be quickly lost if the dynamics of the human heart are not handled wisely. The pursuit continued. Gideon and his 300 men pressed on after the Midianite kings. Even though they were exhausted and weary, they did not stop because of fatigue or lack of recognition. They understood that the task was not yet complete. Faithfulness is measured not only by how one begins, but by perseverance to the very end. This phase of the story reveals growing maturity. The man who once asked repeatedly for signs now made firm decisions. The leader who once hid now advanced, even when his body was worn out. God had formed in Gideon not only faith, but endurance. Victory was being consolidated, yet the road to complete liberation still required facing new tests. both external and internal. For power reveals not only strength, but also the fractures within character. And what followed would test Gideon's leadership in an even deeper way. As the pursuit continued, physical and emotional exhaustion became increasingly evident. Gideon and the 300 men pressed on after the Midianite kings without rest, moving through territories where the victory had not yet been acknowledged or celebrated. They were drained, yet unwilling to stop. The mission was not finished, and weariness could not become an excuse to abandon the purpose. In this state of weakness, Gideon asked for help. When he reached Succoth, he requested food for his men. He did not ask for luxury or reward, only basic provision to continue the pursuit. However, the response he received was mockery and distrust. The leaders of the city refused to help, questioning Gideon's authority and doubting whether victory was truly assured. The refusal was not neutral. It was a decision shaped by fear. Succoth chose self-preservation over participation in Israel's deliverance. Years of oppression had taught many to survive by avoiding risk, even if that meant abandoning those fighting for shared freedom. Gideon did not respond with immediate anger. He answered with a firm warning. He declared that when the Lord delivered the Midianite kings into his hands, he would return and address their refusal. His words did not arise from wounded pride, but from a clear understanding of collective responsibility in the process of liberation. The same scene repeated itself in Penuel. There too, help was denied. Not only did they refuse provision, but they mocked Gideon's authority. Once again, fear dictated the response. They preferred to remain on good terms with the enemy, rather than align themselves with God's unfolding purpose. The pursuit continued. Despite exhaustion and lack of support, Gideon pressed forward. He eventually overtook the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, and defeated them. With their fall, the threat was finally neutralized. The oppression that had plagued Israel for years came to a decisive end. Then Gideon returned. He went back to Succoth and Penuel, not to act out of impulsive revenge, but to execute justice. He confronted the leaders who had refused assistance and reminded them of their responsibility. His actions were not personal retaliation, but a clear message: deliverance requires commitment, and neutrality in the face of oppression carries consequences. This episode reveals another dimension of leadership. Gideon was no longer merely a man obeying in fear. He was now exercising authority. He understood that leadership involves making difficult decisions, even when they are unpopular. Justice is not always comfortable, but it is necessary to sustain restoration. Weariness did not cancel obedience. Lack of support did not weaken the mission. Gideon had learned to move forward even when the environment failed to respond as expected. His leadership was being solidified not only in victory, but in firmness to correct and confront. The story was nearing its conclusion. Yet one final test remained, perhaps the most subtle of all: what Gideon would do when the people sought to make him king. With the Midianite kings defeated and the oppression finally broken, Israel experienced something it had not known for a long time: peace. The threat that had defined daily life was gone, and the nation could finally breathe freely. In that moment of relief and gratitude, the people turned their attention to the man who had led their deliverance. The proposal was direct. The people of Israel approached Gideon and asked him to rule over them. Not only he, but also his sons and his grandsons. They wanted to establish a dynasty, a permanent human leadership structure that would guarantee long-term security. For a people exhausted by recurring cycles of oppression, the idea of a strong king seemed logical. Gideon's response was correct. At first, he rejected the offer and declared that he would not rule over them because the Lord was to be their king. His words reflected a clear understanding of divine order. Israel did not need a human monarch to replace dependence on God. Gideon's leadership had been effective precisely because he had recognized that victory came from the Lord. But the story does not end there. Although he refused the title of king, Gideon asked for something else. He requested the gold earrings taken as plunder from the Midianites. Each man contributed part of the spoils, and the amount collected was considerable. What began as an apparently harmless request would soon reveal a dangerous fracture. With the gold, Gideon made an ephod. This object carried religious significance. In its proper context, the ephod was associated with the priesthood, but the ephod Gideon made was not established by divine command. He placed it in his city, Ophrah, and over time it became an object of veneration. The consequences were tragic. Israel began to prostitute itself spiritually by following the ephod. What had emerged from a victory granted by God became a new form of idolatry. Even Gideon's own household was affected. The deliverer who had once confronted idols had now, without explicit intent, introduced a new stumbling block. This turn of events is deeply revealing. Gideon did not seek the throne, but he allowed something else to occupy a place it did not belong. The danger is not always found in what we reject, but in what we accept without discernment. Victory had been total, yet the human heart remained vulnerable. God had used Gideon powerfully, but the narrative shows that even the most faithful instruments can falter when focus shifts. Dependence that begins in obedience can subtly transform into spiritual self-affirmation if it is not guarded. Still, during Gideon's days, the land had rest. His leadership brought stability. Peace was real, yet the seed of a future fall had been quietly planted, not through defeat, but through a decision made in a season of success. The story was moving toward its final reflection, and what remained to be revealed was not only the end of Gideon's life, but the lasting impact of his decisions on the generations that would follow. The conclusion of Gideon's story is not presented as a simple triumphant ending, but as an honest portrait of human leadership marked by both light and shadow. After years of conflict, Israel experienced a period of peace. The land rested for decades, free from the oppression that had defined a painful chapter in its history. That rest was undoubtedly the direct result of God's intervention through Gideon's obedience. Gideon lived to an old age. He returned to his home and spent his final years away from the battlefield. He had fulfilled the mission for which he was raised up, breaking the power of Midian and restoring to Israel the possibility of living without fear. His name became associated with one of the most improbable victories in biblical history, a deliverance achieved not by military strength, but by total dependence on God. Yet the legacy was not entirely unblemished. After Gideon's death, Israel once again turned away. The people did not remain faithful to the Lord, nor did they remember with gratitude the deliverance they had received. The same patterns that had led to oppression resurfaced quickly. Idols returned, and Baal once again occupied a place in the hearts of the people. The ephod Gideon had made left a lasting mark. What had begun as an act following victory became a source of stumbling over time. The memory of deliverance blended with misguided practices, and spiritual clarity gradually faded. External peace was not enough to sustain internal faithfulness. Gideon's family was also affected. His many sons and the family structure he left behind did not guarantee spiritual continuity. Later events would reveal conflict, ambition, and violence, showing that transformation had not taken deep root in the next generation. Charismatic leadership did not automatically translate into a lasting spiritual inheritance. This ending does not diminish God's work. On the contrary, it highlights it. God was faithful, patient, and powerful. He responded to the people's cry, confronted sin, raised an unlikely deliverer, and granted a victory that no one could claim as their own. The failure that followed was not the result of divine weakness, but of human fragility. Gideon's story leaves a clear and enduring lesson. God can use fearful, insecure, and ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Faith does not need to begin strong. It needs to begin sincere. Yet the narrative also warns that victory does not eliminate the need for constant vigilance. The human heart can drift even after great acts of obedience. Gideon's legacy is deeply human. It is the story of someone who moved from fear to courage, from doubt to obedience, from insignificance to national influence. But it is also the story of how a single misdirected decision can affect entire generations. And perhaps that is its greatest value. Not as the tale of a flawless hero, but as a reminder that dependence on God is not a single event, but a posture that must be maintained to the very end. True victory is not only found in defeating the external enemy, but in remaining faithful when the battle appears to be over. Thus the story of Gideon concludes. A judge raised in a time of ruin, powerfully used by God, and remembered as a testimony that obedient faith can change history, and also that faithfulness must be guarded even after triumph.